Welcome everybody to the 2015 International CES, Gary's Book Club. We did this last year, doing it again this year. Really excited to have some top tech writers to talk about new books they've put out. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to read Paul Paetz's book, Disruption by Design. I think jumping right into it, as a tech analyst, one of the words, there's a lot of buzzwords that we both embrace and try to avoid overusing, but I think one of the most ubiquitous terms right now is, few would argue, is disruption. One of Paul's main points in the book is that this term is actually being misused and misunderstood. So Paul, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you've had significant experience looking at these trends and writing about them. What made you write the book, and who's the target audience for this?
Sure. Well, my background includes a long history in technology, software technology companies, and working with a number of innovative companies that could have been and or were disruptive. In fact, the very first company that I worked for was the one that got me interested and excited about this whole idea, because we had technology that we thought was world-beating, that you know, by all accounts was the best of its kind and should have been as big as an Oracle or a Microsoft or a Google, but we never broke through. And I became fascinated by there's 99% of the companies in Silicon Valley never make it, and we only hear about the 1% that do and that become something important. So some time back I encountered Clay Christensen's Innovators Dilemma. I read that. I didn't really parse it and understand it in the first go round, but after a time I came back to it, and I realized that the pattern clicked with me, and I realized that it was an explanation for a lot of what I had been through the previous 15, 20 years. And I started to dissect that experience, and I realized that this was an explanation for a lot of, not just why companies succeed and don't, but as an explanation of growth, economic growth, you know, beyond just technology, and I started doing analysis and realized that almost all real growth comes from disruptive innovation, if we properly define what disruptive innovation is.
Well, and you talk about, you kind of disabuse the notion when we think of a Ray Kroc or a Steve Jobs, you know, some of these titans of innovation and disruption. We tend to think these are one in a million, you know, geniuses, which in some regards they certainly are. But you talk about the fact that disruption is not only something that can be learned, but implemented, and really approach it from a strategic angle of disruption by design, and talking about how following some of these steps, these are behaviors that businesses can and should utilize.
Absolutely. Some of the more recent big names, like Steve Jobs and Reed Hastings of Netflix, they actually have read the Innovators Dilemma and tried to apply it. So there are some examples of people that actually understood the theory and experimented with trying to figure out how to apply it. Many more just think that disruptive means cool and bright shiny object, and so they use it as a marketing term rather than as a prescriptive and strategic tool for designing a company.
Well, and you talk specifically about, speaking of how it's misused, or companies that want to believe their own hype even if they do have some measure of success. One of the things that I was most fascinated by in the book is the notion that it's not necessarily big companies that make obvious mistakes in hindsight that we can see led to disruption. You maintain that a lot of companies that are doing all the right things are not only ripe for disruption, but in some regards are the most susceptible to it.
Right, and that actually was an observation that that Christensen made in the first place when he was writing the introduction to the Innovators Dilemma. He mentioned that the reason he was writing it was because big companies seemed to be following all the rules. They were name brand companies like IBM and Kodak, and they were getting disrupted, even though they were doing everything right. And the question that I raise is, what does it mean if companies are persistently doing the same thing over and over again, and we call that right? That doesn't make sense. If that leads to disruption, then it's the wrong thing.
And I think as it pertains to the International CES, and certainly to the work we do at CEA and the market research, the whole idea that innovation is by its definition, if not intent, a ceaselessly changing, a ceaselessly evolving process. And I again found kind of the shock of recognition reading your book, the idea that because we have so much innovation that we can point to, there's a copycat phenomenon where people have become stagnant by believing that they're innovating or being disruptive, and as you say, it becomes more of an adjective than a prescriptive way to do business. And I think you do a great job of articulating how that works and why it works.
Well, thanks for that. I do believe that, well, you can see around here, there's all kinds of innovation happening, but easily 99% of it is sustaining. And what that means is it's incremental, it's along the path of a natural evolution, and companies are just improving what they've already got. And that's natural, that's how you maximize the profit out of a particular product. But it isn't how you change the playing field and capture new markets. And that's what disruption is about.
And I think the concrete example that I found fascinating, Kodak as one of the iconic brands of not only the last century, but going back to the 1800s. You really do a case study there, and then segue later into Apple. Maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of the differences, the similarities and differences in the two, and maybe kind of ironically how we're seeing, perhaps as a direct result of Steve Jobs' premature passing, how Apple may be now in danger of no longer having that philosophy.
Yeah, I found the parallel between Kodak and Apple to be fascinating, because at the same year that Kodak had its maximum market cap and valuation was when Apple was months from bankruptcy and Steve Jobs came back in. And 15 years later, Kodak was on the ropes and bankrupt, and Apple was the most valuable company in the world. And if you chart their market cap lines, they went like this, almost 100%, sure. Except that you have to normalize the graphs, because if you actually did it properly, Apple was up here. And it was, for me, illustrative of, the interesting thing about Kodak is that it was a serial disruptor. From the very beginning, very much like Apple has been the last, well, at least since '97, and the last couple of years maybe not so much. But their growth led to such a stranglehold on the industry that they had the consent decree imposed in 1954, which basically forced them to license their photo finishing technology to other companies. And still into the 1970s, they retained something like 80% market share in the US. So even at what appeared to be the peak of their success, they were already highly disruptible. And in fact, in 1976, I think it was, Kodak actually invented the digital camera, and 6 years later, they put it on the shelf because they didn't know what to do with it. They thought it would undermine their chemistry business. And 6 years later, Sony brought out the first commercial digital camera, which that's a crazy lead on the market, and Kodak kind of had the opportunity to keep on disrupting, but that DNA was already gone from their veins.
Right, and so then conversely, I found it very enlightening, your kind of deconstruction of the whole Apple story. I certainly will admit that I have believed the hype, because I think it's warranted, that Steve Jobs was an iconic, once-in-a-generation genius, but you really point out that as they were ascending and disrupting, they weren't afraid to disrupt their own ascendant products. So for instance, the iPod, which I think you describe as perhaps the most disruptive product, of the last 20 years. They were, at the time, I mean, to your earlier point, I think business people would have said, objectively, you can't do that because you're going to undercut your own products. And they saw that doesn't matter because we're creating new realities and creating new products that are meeting an underserved market.
Right. Well, obviously the iPhone has almost completely killed off the iPod, but had Apple not been willing to do that, someone else would have. So it may seem counterintuitive in most business environments, but it's that willingness to always be pushing the envelope and looking at what jobs customers are trying to accomplish with with the products. Why are they buying it? Not what's cool and I think we get caught up with our existing customer bases, and they always want this continuous next best thing, and we ignore that there's a big underserved market that's looking for something else, or looking for a more complete view of getting the job done.
Well, you talk in great detail, and again, this is in addition to being a book that people can read for the historical import, this really is a manual of sorts for any entrepreneur, innovator to follow. So in that regard, I consider it an invaluable and very necessary addition to our literature. But maybe you can describe briefly what are some of the things that companies do wrong consistently, and some of the things companies do right or get right, in addition to, of course, understanding and maybe inherently applying some of these strategies.
Well, if their desire is to be disruptive, then the first thing you have to understand is why markets get disrupted. So there's a causal mechanism which I've worked through in my years doing consulting with a number of innovative companies. But and we can talk about that if you like, but I'll leave that one aside. What a company's persistently doing wrong is not looking for, if your product is serving, say, 3 or 5% of the market, that means it's not serving 95% of the market, and that's of the defined market. If you look outside the boundaries of the defined market, there could be 100 times larger market that nobody's touching, and the reason they're not touching it is because you're not accomplishing the jobs that the customers really want. So we tend to define products and categories. So we talk about a notebook market, and we talk about an iPhone market or a smartphone market. In reality, there's no such thing as a smartphone market. The market should actually be defined by the jobs people are trying to accomplish, not by the product categories and who makes them. So, and that's the biggest mistake I think is made.
What would you say to a skeptic or a cynic that today says, well, we've gone as far as we can go. Now with smartphones, everyone has a computer in their pocket. How can you disrupt that? What's left? I mean, and I say that rhetorically, facetiously. I think those are the questions people have always asked, whether it was Kodak. We've got a camera that you can take a picture and print it immediately. How do we get more futuristic than that? But what do you say to people that think there's no more future? We're there. We've arrived.
Well, in fact, I think we absolutely haven't arrived at the future. And if I look at the amount of progress we made in the 20th century, 1900s, everything from medicine and putting man on the moon, cars, radio, TV, the number of earth-shattering inventions that came out in the 1900s. The last major thing we had like that, of that nature, was a microwave oven. That was in the 1970s. There's been nothing. I mean, the iPhone doesn't even, it's a great product and I love it, but it doesn't even hold a candle to how shattering the microwave oven was, and we have not explored all the possible physical laws of nature that are going to uncover lots of opportunities to make our lives better. We have all kinds of progress to make in getting rid of disease and in living healthier lives, and modes of transportation and communication. All the big things. Energy. If we don't solve energy and cleaning up the environment, we're not going to survive another century. So there's lots of things left to do.
And do you? So you walk around CES, I would hope and imagine, with an optimism that, of course, these companies are trying to change lives, make things more interesting and engaging. But there's a lot of companies out there where the heart of innovation is to improve lives, to sustain life, to make lives more livable. When I walk around the floor, again, in addition to the amazing bells and whistles and the spectacle of good electronics, I'm heartened by the fact that there are people, whether it's a small startup or existing iconic companies, that are doing the things you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I think most of what we see here is still incremental, and we need some big idea, big thinking. And I heard some allusion to that from the Ford keynote the other day. We were talking about how all, we can't, if China and India start having as many cars per capita as we have in North America, the planet will become completely choked. So we've got to, there's no way we can't have a different model and survive.
So we've got a few minutes left, and I definitely wanted to ask, you also address and talk about in the book, I think kind of the counter argument is that disruption, I don't think, has jumped the shark as a term, even though we overuse it and misuse it. But we're starting to get some inevitable blowback with people saying disruption is not a good thing. Disruption is killing companies, is costing jobs. And you maintain the exact opposite, and quite forcefully say that disruption is not only necessary but essential for growth, economic and otherwise.
Yeah. I think I might have mentioned this a little bit earlier, but based on some analysis that I did, I looked at the S&P 500 and looked at data over the last 50 years and growth and dividends, and almost all growth, when you subtract out inflation, is due to disruptive innovation. Almost every other company that's not introducing disruption is basically flatlining or failing. So if disruption is about economic growth, and you create new opportunities when you do that, new opportunities for good jobs, for better living, and if anything, we've slowed down. The amount of disruption we did in the 1900s was way more than we're doing now. Ironically, even though we talk about it more now, there was way more of it happening through the 20th century, and we need to get back to that kind of a optimism and big thinking about all opportunities to make life better. And companies that no company is entitled to have their business model persist forever. Their job is to satisfy customer needs, and if they're not doing that, I don't have any problem with them failing in the market. And the jobs that are created by disruptors like Google and Microsoft before them and Apple, far more jobs created than are lost.
And I think there's nowhere more appropriate to hear and receive this message than at the International CES, where this is all going down. Final words, are you optimistic that we sit down in 5 years and 10 years, we will be looking back at the start of the 21st century as a time where disruption was embraced and understood?
I hope so. I mean, I really hope that, starting with entrepreneurs that read this book, that they'll start to understand that they can control whether or not disruption happens. But beyond that, there's no reason that companies have to get disrupted. If they maintain a culture over time that is constantly looking at the future, not just optimizing, maximizing profit in the short term, which I think is one of the mistakes that companies, as they get large, they shift from exploration and thinking big ideas to how do we maximize profit for the next 3 months, and that really is that really undermines their ability to stay innovative. So,
well, Paul, it was a genuine pleasure to read the book. Any innovator, entrepreneur, anyone looking to understand current trends, I think this is an invaluable addition to our literature. And Paul will be signing the book for the next half hour over at our stand over there. So come say hi to him and get a copy of the book. Paul, thanks for joining us today. I learned a lot.
Thank you very much.